Chapters. The Duc de Beaufort. The circumstances that had hastened the return of D'Artagnan to Paris were as follows. One evening, when Mazarin, according to custom, went to visit the queen, in passing the guard chamber he heard loud voices. Wishing to know on what topic the soldiers were conversing, he approached with his wonted wolf-like step, pushed open the door, and put his head close to the chink. There was a dispute among the guards. "I tell you," one of them was saying, "that if Coysel predicted that, 'tis as good as true. I know nothing about it, but I have heard say that he's not only an astrologer, but a magician." "Deuce take it, friend, if he's one of thy friends thou wilt ruin him in saying so." "Why?" "Because he may be tried for it." "Ah, absurd, they don't burn sorcerers nowadays." "No, 'tis not a long time since the late cardinal burnt Urban Grandier, though." "My friend, Urban Grandier wasn't a sorcerer. He was a learned man. He didn't predict the future. He knew the past, often a more dangerous thing." Mazarin nodded an assent, but wishing to know what this prediction was, about which they disputed, he remained in the same place. "I don't say," resumed the guard, "that Coysel is not a sorcerer, but I say that if his prophecy gets wind, it's a sure way to prevent its coming true." "How so?" "Why, in this way. If Coysel says loud enough for the cardinal to hear him, on such or such a day such a prisoner will escape, 'tis plain that the cardinal will take measures of precaution and that the prisoner will not escape." "Good Lord," said another guard, who might have been thought asleep on a bench, but who had lost not a syllable of the conversation. "Do you suppose that men can escape their destiny? If it is written yonder in heaven that the Duc de Beaufort is to escape, he will escape, and all the precautions of the cardinal will not prevent it." Mazarin started. He was an Italian and therefore superstitious. He walked straight into the midst of the guards, who on seeing him were silent. "What were you saying?" he asked with his flattering manner. "That Monsieur de Beaufort had escaped, were you not?" "Oh no, my lord," said the incredulous soldier. "He's well guarded now. We only said he would escape." "Who said so?" "Repeat your story, Saint Laurent," replied the man, turning to the originator of the tale. "My lord," said the guard, "I have simply mentioned the prophecy I heard from a man named Coysel, who believes that, be he ever so closely watched and guarded, the Duke of Beaufort will escape before Whitsuntide." "Coysel is a madman," returned the cardinal. "No," replied the soldier, tenacious in his credulity. "He has foretold many things which have come to pass. For instance, that the queen would have a son, that Monsieur Coligny would be killed in a duel with the Duc de Guise, and finally, that the coadjutor would be made cardinal. Well, the queen has not only one son, but two. Then, Monsieur de Coligny was killed and—" "Yes," said Mazarin, "but the coadjutor is not yet made cardinal." "No, my lord, but he will be," answered the guard. Mazarin made a grimace, as if he meant to say, "But he does not wear the cardinal's cap." Then he added, "So, my friend, it's your opinion that Monsieur de Beaufort will escape?" "That's my idea, my lord, and if your eminence were to offer to make me at this moment governor of the castle of Vincennes, I should refuse it. After Whitsuntide, it would be another thing." There is nothing so convincing as a firm conviction. It has its own effect upon the most incredulous, and far from being incredulous, Mazarin was superstitious. He went away thoughtful and anxious, and returned to his own room, where he summoned Bernouin and desired him to fetch thither in the morning the special guard he had placed over Monsieur de Beaufort, and to awaken him whenever he should arrive. The guard had, in fact, touched the cardinal in the tenderest point. During the whole 5 years in which the Duc de Beaufort had been in prison, not a day had passed in which the cardinal had not felt a secret dread of his escape. It was not possible, as he knew well, to confine for the whole of his life the grandson of Henry IV, especially when this young prince was scarcely 30 years of age. But however and whensoever he did escape, what hatred he must cherish against him to whom he owed his long imprisonment, who had taken him, rich, brave, glorious, beloved by women, feared by men, to cut off his life's best, happiest years. For it is not life, it is merely existence, in prison. Meantime, Mazarin redoubled his surveillance over the duke, but like the miser in the fable, he he could not sleep for thinking of his treasure. Often he awoke in the night, suddenly, dreaming that he had been robbed of Monsieur de Beaufort. Then he inquired about him, and had the vexation of hearing that the prisoner played, drank, sang, but that whilst playing, drinking, singing, he often stopped short to vow that Mazarin should pay dear for all the amusements he had forced him to enter into at Vincennes. So much did this one idea haunt the cardinal even in his sleep, that when at 7 in the morning Bernouin came to arouse him, his first words were, "Well, what's the matter? Has Monsieur de Beaufort escaped from Vincennes?" "I do not think so, my lord," said Bernouin. "But you will hear about him, for La Ramee is here and awaits the commands of your eminence." "Tell him to come in," said Mazarin, arranging his pillows so that he might receive the visitor sitting up in bed. The officer entered, a large fat man with an open physiognomy. His air of perfect serenity made Mazarin uneasy. "Approach, sir," said the cardinal. The officer obeyed. "Do you know what they are saying here?" "No, your eminence." "Well, they say that Monsieur de Beaufort is going to escape from Vincennes, if he has not done so already." The officer's face expressed complete stupefaction. He opened at once his little eyes and his great mouth to inhale better the joke his eminence deigned to address to him, and ended by a burst of laughter, so violent that his great limbs shook in hilarity as they would have done in an ague. "Escape, my lord, escape. Your eminence does not then know where Monsieur de Beaufort is?" "Yes, I do, sir, in the donjon of Vincennes." "Yes, sir, in a room the walls of which are 7 feet thick, with grated windows, each bar as thick as my arm." "Sir," replied Mazarin, "with perseverance one may penetrate through a wall, with a watch spring one may saw through an iron bar." "Then my lord does not know that there are 8 guards about him, 4 in his chamber, 4 in the antechamber, and that they never leave him." "But he leaves his room. He plays at tennis at the mall." "Sir, those amusements are allowed, but if your eminence wishes it, we will discontinue the permission." "No, no," cried Mazarin, fearing that should his prisoner ever leave his prison, he would be the more exasperated against him if he thus retrenched his amusement. He then asked with whom he played. "My lord, either with the officers of the guard, with the other prisoners, or with me." "But does he not approach the walls while playing?" "Your eminence doesn't know those walls. They are 60 feet high, and I doubt if Monsieur de Beaufort is sufficiently weary of life to risk his neck by jumping off." "Hum," said the cardinal, beginning to feel more comfortable. "You mean to say, then, my dear Monsieur la Ramee, that unless Monsieur de Beaufort can contrive to metamorphose himself into a little bird, I will continue answerable for him." "Take care, you assert a great deal," said Mazarin. Monsieur de Beaufort told the guards who took him to Vincennes that he had often thought what he should do in case he were put into prison, and that he had found out 40 ways of escaping. "My lord, if among these 40 there had been one good way, he would have been out long ago." "Come, come, not such a fool as I fancied," thought Mazarin. "Besides, my lord must remember that Monsieur de Chavigny is governor of Vincennes," continued La Ramee, "and that Monsieur de Chavigny is not friendly to Monsieur de Beaufort." "Yes, but Monsieur de Chavigny is sometimes absent." "When he is absent, I am there." "But when you leave him, for instance?" "Oh, when I leave him, I place in my stead a bold fellow who aspires to be His Majesty's special guard. I promise you, he keeps a good watch over the prisoner. During the 3 weeks that he has been with me, I have only had to reproach him with one thing, being too severe with the prisoners." "And who is this Cerberus?" "A certain Monsieur Grimaud, my lord." "And what was he before he went to Vincennes?" "He was in the country, as I was told by the person who recommended him to me." "And who recommended this man to you?" "The steward of the Duc de Gramont." "He is not a gossip, I hope." "Lord a mercy, my lord, I thought for a long time that he was dumb. He answers only by signs. It seems his former master accustomed him to that." "Well, dear Monsieur la Ramee," replied the cardinal, "let him prove a true and thankful keeper, and we will shut our eyes upon his rural misdeeds and put on his back a uniform to make him respectable, and in the pockets of that uniform some pistols to drink to the king's health. Mazarin was large in promises, quite unlike the virtuous Monsieur Grimaud so bepraised by La Ramée, for he said nothing and did much. It was now 9 o'clock. The cardinal, therefore, got up, perfumed himself, dressed, and went to the queen to tell her what had detained him. The queen, who was scarcely less afraid of Monsieur de Beaufort than the cardinal himself, and who was almost as superstitious as he was, made him repeat word for word all La Ramée's praises of his deputy. Then, when the cardinal had ended, "Alas, sir, why have we not a Grimaud near every prince?" "Patience," replied Mazarin with his Italian smile. "That may happen one day, but in the meantime—" "Well, in the meantime, I shall still take precautions." And he wrote to D'Artagnan to hasten his return. Chapter 20. Duc de Beaufort amused his leisure hours in the donjon of Vincennes. The captive, who was the source of so much alarm to the cardinal, and whose means of escape disturbed the repose of the whole court, was wholly unconscious of the terror he caused at the Palais Royal. He had found himself so strictly guarded that he soon perceived the fruitlessness of any attempt at escape. His vengeance, therefore, consisted in coining curses on the head of Mazarin. He even tried to make some verses on him, but soon gave up the attempt, for Monsieur de Beaufort had not only not received from heaven the gift of versifying, he had the greatest difficulty in expressing himself in prose. The Duke was the grandson of Henry IV, and Gabrielle d'Estrées, as good-natured, as brave, as proud, and above all, as Gascon as his ancestor, but less elaborately educated. After having been for some time after the death of Louis XIII, the favorite, the confidant, the first man, in short, at the court, he had been obliged to yield his place to Mazarin, and so became the second in influence and favor. And eventually, as he was stupid enough to be vexed at this change of position, the queen had had him arrested and sent to Vincennes in charge of Guiton, who made his appearance in these pages in the beginning of this history, and whom we shall see again. It is understood, of course, that when we say the queen, Mazarin is meant. During the 5 years of this seclusion, which would have improved and matured the intellect of any other man, M. de Beaufort, had he not affected to brave the cardinal, despise princes, and walk alone without adherents or disciples, would either have regained his liberty or made partisans. But these considerations never occurred to the Duke, and every day the cardinal received fresh accounts of him which were as unpleasant as possible to the minister. After having failed in poetry, Monsieur de Beaufort tried drawing. He drew portraits with a piece of coal of the cardinal, and as his talents did not enable him to produce a very good likeness, he wrote under the picture that there might be little doubt regarding the original. Portrait of the illustrious coxcomb, Mazarin. Monsieur de Chavigny, the governor of Vincennes, waited upon the Duke to request that he would amuse himself in some other way, or that at all events, if he drew likenesses, he would not put mottos underneath them. The next day the prisoner's room was full of pictures and mottos. Monsieur de Beaufort, in common with many other prisoners, was bent upon doing things that were prohibited, and the only resource the governor had was, one day when the Duke was playing at tennis, to efface all these drawings, consisting chiefly of profiles. M. de Beaufort did not venture to draw the cardinal's fat face. The Duke thanked Monsieur de Chavigny for having, as he said, cleaned his drawing paper for him. He then divided the walls of his room into compartments and dedicated each of these compartments to some incident in Mazarin's life. In one was depicted the illustrious coxcomb receiving a shower of blows from Cardinal Bentivoglio, whose servant he had been. Another, the illustrious Mazarin, acting the part of Ignatius Loyola in a tragedy of that name. A third, the illustrious Mazarin, stealing the portfolio of Prime Minister from Monsieur de Chavigny, who had expected to have it. A fourth, the illustrious coxcomb Mazarin, refusing to give Laporte, the young king's valet, clean sheets, and saving that it was quite enough for the King of France to have clean sheets every 3 months. The governor, of course, thought proper to threaten his prisoner that if he did not give up drawing such pictures, he should be obliged to deprive him of all the means of amusing himself in that manner. To this Monsieur de Beaufort replied that since every opportunity of distinguishing himself in arms was taken from him, he wished to make himself celebrated in the arts. Since he could not be a Bayard, he would become a Raphael or a Michelangelo. Nevertheless, one day when Monsieur de Beaufort was walking in the meadow, his fire was put out, his charcoal all removed, taken away, and thus his means of drawing utterly destroyed. The poor Duke swore, fell into a rage, yelled, and declared that they wished to starve him to death, as they had starved the Maréchal Ornano and the Grand Prior of Vendôme. But he refused to promise that he would not make any more drawings, and remained without any fire in the room all the winter. His next act was to purchase a dog from one of his keepers. With this animal, which he called Pistache, he was often shut up for hours alone, superintending, as everyone supposed, its education. At last, when Pistache was sufficiently well trained, Monsieur de Beaufort invited the governor and officers of Vincennes to attend a representation which he was going to have in his apartment. The party assembled, the room was lighted with waxlights, and the prisoner, with a bit of plaster he had taken out of the wall of his room, had traced a long white line representing a cord on the floor. Pistache, on a signal from his master, placed himself on this line, raised himself on his hind paws, and holding in his front paws a wand with which clothes used to be beaten, he began to dance upon the line with as many contortions as a rope dancer. Having been several times up and down it, he gave the wand back to his master and began without hesitation to perform the same evolutions over again. The intelligent creature was received with loud applause. The first part of the entertainment being concluded, Pistache was desired to say what o'clock it was. He was shown Monsieur de Chavigny's watch. It was then 6:30. The dog raised and dropped his paw 6 times. The 7th he let it remain upraised. Nothing could be better done. A sundial could not have shown the hour with greater precision. Then the question was put to him, who was the best jailer in all the prisons in France. The dog performed 3 evolutions around the circle, and laid himself, with the deepest respect, at the feet of Monsieur de Chavigny, who at first seemed inclined to like the joke and laughed long and loud, but a frown succeeded, and he bit his lips with vexation. Then the Duke put to Pistache this difficult question: who was the greatest thief in the world? Pistache went again around the circle, but stopped at no one, and at last went to the door and began to scratch and bark. "See, gentlemen," said M. de Beaufort, "this wonderful animal, not finding here what I ask for, seeks it out of doors. You shall, however, have his answer. Pistache, my friend, come here. Is not the greatest thief in the world, monsieur, the king's secretary, Le Camus, who came to Paris with 20 francs in his pocket and who now possesses 10 millions? The dog shook his head. "Then is it not," resumed the Duke, "the superintendent Emery, who gave his son, when he was married, 300,000 francs in a house, compared to which the Tuileries are a heap of ruins, and the Louvre a paltry building?" The dog again shook his head as if to say no. "Then," said the prisoner, "let's think who it can be. Can it possibly be the illustrious coxcomb Mazarin de Piscina, hey?" Pistache made violent signs that it was by raising and lowering his head 8 or 10 times successively. "Gentlemen, you see," said the Duke to those present, who dared not even smile, "that it is the illustrious coxcomb who is the greatest thief in the world, at least according to Pistache. Let us go on to another of his exercises. Gentlemen," there was a profound silence in the room when the Duke again addressed them. "Do you not remember that the Duc de Guise taught all the dogs in Paris to jump for Mademoiselle de Pont, whom he styled the fairest of the fair? Pistache is going to show you how superior he is to all other dogs. Monsieur de Chavigny, be so good as to lend me your cane."
Monsieur de Chavigny handed his cane to Monsieur de Beaufort. Monsieur de Beaufort placed it horizontally at the height of 1 foot.
"Now, Pistache, my good dog, jump the height of this cane for Madame de Montbazon."
"But," interposed Monsieur de Chavigny, "it seems to me that Pistache is only doing what other dogs have done when they jumped for Mademoiselle de Pont."
"Stop," said the Duke. "Pistache, jump for the Queen," and he raised his cane 6 inches higher. The dog sprang, and in spite of the height jumped lightly over it. "And now," said the Duke, raising it still 6 inches higher, "jump for the King." The dog obeyed and jumped quickly over the cane. "Now then," said the Duke, and as he spoke, lowered the cane almost level with the ground. "Pistache, my friend, jump for the illustrious coxcomb, Mazarin de Piscina." The dog turned his back to the cane. "What?" asked the Duke. "What do you mean?" And he gave him the cane again, first making a semicircle from the head to the tail of Pistache. "Jump then, Monsieur Pistache." But Pistache, as at first, turned round on his legs and stood with his back to the cane. Monsieur de Beaufort made the experiment a third time, but by this time Pistache's patience was exhausted. He threw himself furiously upon the cane, wrested it from the hands of the prince, and broke it with his teeth. Monsieur de Beaufort took the pieces out of his mouth and presented them with great formality to Monsieur de Chavigny, saying that for that evening the entertainment was ended, but in 3 months it should be repeated, when Pistache would have learned a few new tricks. 3 days afterward, Pistache was found dead, poisoned. Then the Duke said openly that his dog had been killed by a drug with which they meant to poison him. And one day after dinner he went to bed, calling out that he had pains in his stomach and that Mazarin had poisoned him. This fresh impertinence reached the ears of the cardinal and alarmed him greatly. The donjon of Vincennes was considered very unhealthy, and Madame de Rambouillet had said that the room in which the Maréchal Ornano and the Grand Prieur de Vendôme had died was worth its weight in arsenic, a bon mot which had great success. So it was ordered the prisoner was henceforth to eat nothing that had not previously been tasted, and La Ramée was in consequence placed near him as taster. Every kind of revenge was practiced upon the Duke by the governor in return for the insults of the innocent Pistache. De Chavigny, who, according to report, was a son of Richelieu's and had been a creature of the late cardinal's, understood tyranny. He took from the Duke all the steel knives and silver forks and replaced them with silver knives and wooden forks, pretending that as he had been informed that the Duke was to pass all his life at Vincennes, he was afraid of his prisoner attempting suicide. A fortnight afterward, the Duke, going to the tennis court, found 2 rows of trees about the size of his little finger planted by the roadside. He asked what they were for, and was told that they were to shade him from the sun on some future day. One morning, the gardener went to him and told him, as if to please him, that he was going to plant a bed of asparagus for his especial use. Now, since, as everyone knows, asparagus takes 4 years in coming to perfection, this civility infuriated Monsieur de Beaufort. At last his patience was exhausted. He assembled his keepers, and notwithstanding his well-known difficulty of utterance, addressed them as follows. "Gentlemen, will you permit a grandson of Henry IV to be overwhelmed with insults and ignominy? Odds fish, as my grandfather used to say, I once reigned in Paris. Do you know that? I had the king and monsieur the whole of one day in my care. The queen at that time liked me and called me the most honest man in the kingdom. Gentlemen and citizens, set me free. I shall go to the Louvre and strangle Mazarin. You shall be my bodyguard. I will make you all captains with good pensions. Odds fish, on, march forward." But eloquent as he might be, the eloquence of the grandson of Henry IV did not touch those hearts of stone. Not one man stirred. So Monsieur de Beaufort was obliged to be satisfied with calling them all kinds of rascals underneath the sun. Sometimes, when Monsieur de Chavigny paid him a visit, the Duke used to ask him what he should think if he saw an army of Parisians, all fully armed, appear at Vincennes to deliver him from prison. "My lord," answered de Chavigny with a low bow, "I have on the ramparts 20 pieces of artillery and in my casemates 30,000 guns. I should bombard the troops till not one grain of gunpowder was unexploded." "Yes, but after you had fired off your 30,000 guns, they would take the donjon. The donjon being taken, I should be obliged to let them hang you, at which I should be most unhappy, certainly." And in his turn, the Duke bowed low to Monsieur de Chavigny. "For myself, on the other hand, my lord," returned the governor, "when the first rebel should pass the threshold of my postern doors, I should be obliged to kill you with my own hand, since you were confided peculiarly to my care, and as I am obliged to give you up, dead or alive." And once more he bowed low before His Highness. These bittersweet pleasantries lasted 10 minutes, sometimes longer, but always finished thus.
Monsieur de Chavigny, turning toward the door, used to call out, "Hallo, La Ramée!"
La Ramée came into the room. La Ramée, I recommend Monsieur le Duc to you, particularly. Treat him as a man of his rank and family ought to be treated. That is, never leave him alone an instant. La Ramée became therefore the Duke's dinner guest by compulsion, an eternal keeper, the shadow of his person. But La Ramée, gay, frank, convivial, fond of play, a great hand at tennis, had one defect in the Duke's eyes, his incorruptibility. Now, although La Ramée appreciated, as of a certain value, the honor of being shut up with a prisoner of so great importance, still the pleasure of living in intimacy with the grandson of Henry IV hardly compensated for the loss of that which he had experienced in going from time to visit his family. One may be a jailer or a keeper, and at the same time a good father and husband. La Ramée adored his wife and children, whom now he could only catch a glimpse of from the top of the wall, when in order to please him they used to walk on the opposite side of the moat. 'Twas too brief an enjoyment, and La Ramée felt that the gaiety of heart he had regarded as the cause of health, of which it was perhaps rather the result, would not long survive such a mode of life. He accepted, therefore, with delight, an offer made to him by his friend the steward of the Duc de Gramont to give him a substitute. He also spoke of it to Monsieur de Chavigny, who promised that he would not oppose it in any way, that is, if he approved of the person proposed. We consider it useless to draw a physical or moral portrait of Grimaud. If, as we hope, our readers have not wholly forgotten the first part of this work, they must have preserved a clear idea of that estimable individual, who is wholly unchanged, except that he is 20 years older, an advance in life that has made him only more silent, although, since the change that had been working in himself, Athos had given Grimaud permission to speak. But Grimaud had, for 12 or 15 years, preserved habitual silence, and a habit of 15 or 20 years' duration becomes second nature. Chapter 18. Grimaud begins his functions. Grimaud thereupon presented himself with his smooth exterior at the donjon of Vincennes. Now Monsieur de Chavigny piqued himself on his infallible penetration, for that which almost proved that he was the son of Richelieu was his everlasting pretension. He examined attentively the countenance of the applicant for place, and fancied that the contracted eyebrows, thin lips, hooked nose, and prominent cheekbones of Grimaud were favorable signs. He addressed about 12 words to him. Grimaud answered in 4. "Here's a promising fellow, and it is I who have found out his merits," said Monsieur de Chavigny. "Go," he added, "and make yourself agreeable to Monsieur La Ramée, and tell him that you suit me in all respects." Grimaud had every quality that could attract a man on duty who wishes to have a deputy. So after 1,000 questions, which met with only a word in reply, La Ramée, fascinated by this sobriety in speech, rubbed his hands and engaged Grimaud. "My orders," asked Grimaud. "They are these: never to leave the prisoner alone, to keep away from him every pointed or cutting instrument, and to prevent his conversing any length of time with the keepers." "Those are all?" asked Grimaud. "All now," replied La Ramée. "Good," answered Grimaud, and he went right to the prisoner. The Duke was in the act of combing his beard, which he had allowed to grow, as well as his hair, in order to reproach Mazarin with his wretched appearance and condition. But having some days previously seen, from the top of the donjon, Madame de Montbazon pass in her carriage, and still cherishing an affection for that beautiful woman, he did not wish to be to her what he wished to be to Mazarin, and in the hope of seeing her again, had asked for a leaden comb, which was allowed him. The comb was to be a leaden one, because his beard, like that of most fair people, was rather red. He therefore dyed it thus, whilst combing it. As Grimaud entered, he saw this comb on the tea-table. He took it up, and as he took it, he made a low bow. The Duke looked at this strange figure with surprise. The figure put the comb in its pocket. "Ho, hey, what's that?" cried the Duke. "Who is this creature?" Grimaud did not answer, but bowed a second time. "Art thou dumb?" cried the Duke. Grimaud made a sign that he was not. "What art thou, then? Answer, I command thee," said the Duke. "A keeper," replied Grimaud. "A keeper," reiterated the Duke. "There was nothing wanting in my collection except this gallows bird. Halloo, La Ramee, someone." La Ramee ran in haste to obey the call. "Who is this wretch who takes my comb and puts it in his pocket?" asked the Duke. "One of your guards, my prince, a man of talent and merit whom you will like, as I and Monsieur de Chavigny do, I am sure." "Why does he take my comb?" "Why do you take my lord's comb?" asked La Ramee. Grimaud drew the comb from his pocket and, passing his fingers over the largest teeth, pronounced this one word, "pointed." "True," said La Ramee. "What does the animal say?" asked the Duke. "That the king has forbidden your lordship to have any pointed instrument." "Are you mad, La Ramee? You yourself gave me this comb." "I was very wrong, my lord, for in giving it to you I acted in opposition to my orders." The Duke looked furiously at Grimaud. "I perceive that this creature will be my particular aversion," he muttered. Grimaud, nevertheless, was resolved for certain reasons not at once to come to a full rupture with the prisoner. He wanted to inspire, not a sudden repugnance, but a good, sound, steady hatred. He retired, therefore, and gave place to 4 guards, who, having breakfasted, could attend on the prisoner. A fresh practical joke now occurred to the Duke. He had asked for crawfish for his breakfast on the following morning. He intended to pass the day in making a small gallows and hang one of the finest of these fish in the middle of his room, the red color evidently conveying an allusion to the cardinal, so that he might have the pleasure of hanging Mazarin in effigy without being accused of having hung anything more significant than a crawfish. The day was employed in preparations for the execution. Everyone grows childish in prison, but the character of Monsieur de Beaufort was particularly disposed to become so. In the course of his morning's walk, he collected 2 or 3 small branches from a tree and found a small piece of broken glass, a discovery that quite delighted him. When he came home, he formed his handkerchief into a loop. Nothing of all this escaped Grimaud, but La Ramee looked on with the curiosity of a father who thinks that he may perhaps get a cheap idea concerning a new toy for his children. The guards looked on it with indifference. When everything was ready, the gallows hung in the middle of the room, the loop made, and when the Duke had cast a glance upon the plate of crawfish, in order to select the finest specimen among them, he looked around for his piece of glass. It had disappeared. "Who has taken my piece of glass?" asked the Duke, frowning. Grimaud made a sign to denote that he had done so. "What, thou again? Why didst thou take it?" "Yes, why?" asked La Ramee. Grimaud, who held the piece of glass in his hand, said, "Sharp." "True, my lord," exclaimed La Ramee. "Ah, deuce take it, we have a precious fellow here." "Monsieur Grimaud," said the Duke, "for your sake I beg of you, never come within the reach of my fist." "Hush, hush!" cried La Ramee. "Give me your gibbet, my lord. I will shape it out for you with my knife." And he took the gibbet and shaped it out as neatly as possible. "That's it," said the Duke. "Now make me a little hole in the floor whilst I go and fetch the culprit." La Ramee knelt down and made a hole in the floor. Meanwhile, the Duke hung the crawfish up by a thread. Then he placed the gibbet in the middle of the room, bursting with laughter. La Ramee laughed also, and the guards laughed in chorus. Grimaud, however, did not even smile. He approached La Ramee and, showing him the crawfish hung up by the thread, "Cardinal," he said. "Hung by order of His Highness the Duc de Beaufort," cried the prisoner, laughing violently, "and by Master Jacques Chrysostom La Ramee, the king's commissioner." La Ramee uttered a cry of horror and rushed toward the gibbet, which he broke at once and threw the pieces out of the window. He was going to throw the crawfish out also when Grimaud snatched it from his hands. "Good to eat," he said, and put it in his pocket. This scene so enchanted the Duke that at the moment he forgave Grimaud for his part in it, but on reflection he hated him more and more, being convinced he had some evil motive for his conduct. But the story of the crab made a great noise through the interior of the donjon and even outside. Monsieur de Chavigny, who at heart detested the cardinal, took pains to tell the story to 2 or 3 friends, who put it into immediate circulation. The prisoner, happened to remark among the guards one man with a very good countenance, and he favored this man the more as Grimaud became the more and more odious to him. One morning he took this man on one side and had succeeded in speaking to him, when Grimaud entered and, seeing what was going on, approached the Duke respectfully, but took the guard by the arm. "Go away," he said. The guard obeyed. "You are insupportable," cried the Duke. "I shall beat you." Grimaud bowed. "I will break every bone in your body," cried the Duke. Grimaud bowed but stepped back. "Mr. Spy," cried the Duke, more and more enraged, "I will strangle you with my own hands." And he extended his hands toward Grimaud, who merely thrust the guard out and shut the door behind him. At the same time, he felt the Duke's arms on his shoulders like two iron claws, but instead, either of calling out or defending himself, he placed his forefinger on his lips and said in a low tone, "Hush!" smiling as he uttered the word. A gesture, a smile, and a word from Grimaud, all at once, were so unusual that His Highness stopped short, astounded. Grimaud took advantage of that instant to draw from his vest a charming little note with an aristocratic seal and presented it to the Duke without a word. The Duke, more and more bewildered, let Grimaud loose and took the note. "From Madame de Montbazon?" he cried. Grimaud nodded assent. The Duke tore open the note, passed his hands over his eyes, for he was dazzled and confused, and read, "My dear Duke, you may entirely confide in the brave lad who will give you this note. He has consented to enter the service of your keeper and to shut himself up at Vincennes with you, in order to prepare and assist your escape, which we are contriving. The moment of your deliverance is at hand. Have patience and courage, and remember that in spite of time and absence, all your friends continue to cherish for you the sentiments they have so long professed and truly entertained. Yours wholly and most affectionately,
Marie de Montbazon.
P.S. I sign my full name, for I should be vain if I could suppose that after 5 years of absence you would remember my initials." The poor Duke became perfectly giddy. What for 5 years he had been wanting, a faithful servant, a friend, a helping hand, seemed to have fallen from heaven just when he expected it the least. "Oh, dearest Marie, she thinks of me then after 5 years of separation. Heavens, there is constancy." Then turning to Grimaud, he said, "And thou, my brave fellow, thou consentest thus to aid me?" Grimaud signified his assent. "And you have come here with that purpose?" Grimaud repeated the sign. "And I was ready to strangle you," cried the Duke. Grimaud smiled. "Wait, then," said the Duke, fumbling in his pocket. "Wait," he continued, renewing his fruitless search. "It shall not be said that such devotion to a grandson of Henry IV went without recompense." The Duke's endeavors evinced the best intention in the world, but one of the precautions taken at Vincennes was that of allowing prisoners to keep no money. Whereupon Grimaud, observing the Duke's disappointment, drew from his pocket a purse filled with gold and handed it to him. "Here is what you are looking for," he said. The Duke opened the purse and wanted to empty it into Grimaud's hands, but Grimaud shook his head. "Thank you, Monseigneur," he said, drawing back. "I am paid." The Duke went from one surprise to another. He held out his hand. Grimaud drew near and kissed it respectfully. The grand manner of Athos had left its mark on Grimaud. "What shall we do, and when, and how proceed?" "It is now 11, answered Grimaud. "Let my lord at 2 o'clock ask leave to make up a game at tennis with La Ramee, and let him send 2 or 3 balls over the ramparts. And then, your Highness will approach the walls and call out to a man who works in the moat to send them back again." "I understand," said the Duke. Grimaud made a sign that he was going away. "Ah!" cried the Duke, "will you not accept any money from me?" "I wish my lord would make me one promise." "What, speak?" "'Tis this, when we escape together, that I shall go everywhere and be always first. For if my lord should be overtaken and caught, there's every chance of his being brought back to prison, whereas if I am caught, the least that can befall me is to be hung." "True, on my honor as a gentleman it shall be as thou dost suggest." "Now," resumed Grimaud, "I've only one thing more to ask, that your Highness will continue to detest me." "I'll try," said the Duke. At this moment, La Ramee, after the interview we have described with the cardinal, entered the room. The duke had thrown himself, as he was wont to do in moments of dullness and vexation, on his bed. La Ramee cast an inquiring look around him, and observing the same signs of antipathy between the prisoner and his guardian, he smiled in token of his inward satisfaction. Then turning to Grimaud, "Very good, my friend, very good. You have been spoken of in a promising quarter, and you will soon, I hope, have news that will be agreeable to you." Grimaud saluted in his politest manner and withdrew, as was his custom on the entrance of his superior. "Well, my lord," said La Ramee with his rude laugh, "you still set yourself against this poor fellow?" "So, 'tis you, La Ramee. In faith, 'tis time you came back again. I threw myself on the bed and turned my nose to the wall that I mightn't break my promise and strangle Grimaud." "I doubt, however," said La Ramee, in sprightly allusion to the silence of his subordinate, "if he has said anything disagreeable to your highness." "Pardieu, you are right, a mute from the East. I swear it was time for you to come back, La Ramee, and I was eager to see you again." "Monseigneur is too good," said La Ramee, flattered by the compliment. "Yes," continued the duke, "really, I feel bored today beyond the power of description." "Then let us have a match in the tennis court," exclaimed La Ramee. "If you wish it. I am at your service, my lord." "I protest, my dear La Ramee," said the duke, "that you are a charming fellow, and that I would stay forever at Vincennes to have the pleasure of your society." "My lord," replied La Ramee, "I think if it depended on the cardinal your wishes would be fulfilled." "What do you mean? Have you seen him lately?" "He sent for me today." "Really, to speak to you about me?" "Of what else do you imagine he would speak to me? Really, my lord, you are his nightmare." The duke smiled with bitterness. "Ah, La Ramee, if you would but accept my offers, I would make your fortune." "How? You would no sooner have left prison than your goods would be confiscated." "I shall no sooner be out of prison than I shall be master of Paris." "Pshaw, pshaw! I cannot hear such things said as that. This is a fine conversation with an officer of the king. I see, my lord, I shall be obliged to fetch a second Grimaud." "Very well, let us say no more about it. So you and the cardinal have been talking about me? La Ramee, some day when he sends for you, you must let me put on your clothes. I will go in your stead. I will strangle him, and upon my honor, if that is made a condition, I will return to prison." "Monseigneur, I see well that I must call Grimaud." "Well, I am wrong, and what did the cuisse say about me?" "I admit the word, Monseigneur, because it rhymes with minister, minister. What did he say to me? He told me to watch you." "And why so? Why watch me?" asked the duke uneasily. "Because an astrologer had predicted that you would escape." "Ah, an astrologer predicted that?" said the duke, starting in spite of himself.
Oh, mon Dieu. Yes, those imbeciles of magicians can only imagine things to torment honest people.
"And what did you reply to his most illustrious eminence?" "That if the astrologer in question made almanacs, I would advise him not to buy one." "Why not?" "Because before you could escape, you would have to be turned into a bird." "Unfortunately, that is true. Let us go and have a game at tennis, La Ramee." "My lord, I beg your highness's pardon, but I must beg for half an hour's leave of absence." "Why?" "Because Monseigneur Mazarin is a prouder man than his highness, though not of such high birth. He forgot to ask me to breakfast." "Well, shall I send for some breakfast here?" "No, my lord. I must tell you that the confectioner who lived opposite the castle, Daddy Marteau, as they called him." "Well?" "Well, he sold his business a week ago to a confectioner from Paris, an invalid, ordered country air for his health." "Well, what have I to do with that?" "Why, good lord, this man, your highness, when he saw me stop before his shop, where he has a display of things which would make your mouth water, my lord, asked me to get him the custom of the prisoners in the donjon. I bought," said he, "the business of my predecessor on the strength of his assurance that he supplied the castle, whereas, on my honor, Monsieur de Chavigny, though I've been here a week, has not ordered so much as a tartlet." "But," I then replied, "probably Monsieur de Chavigny is afraid your pastry is not good." "My pastry not good? Well, Monsieur la Ramee, you shall judge of it yourself and at once. I cannot, I replied. It is absolutely necessary for me to return to the chateau. Very well, said he. Go and attend to your affairs, since you seem to be in a hurry, but come back in half an hour. In half an hour? Yes. Have you breakfasted? Faith, no. Well, here is a pot that will be ready for you, with a bottle of old Burgundy. So you see, my lord, since I am hungry, I would, with your highness's leave, and La Ramee bent low. Go then, animal, said the duke, but remember I only allow you half an hour. May I promise your custom to the successor of Father Marteau, my lord? Yes, if he does not put mushrooms in his pies. Thou knowest that mushrooms from the wood of Vincennes are fatal to my family. La Ramee went out, but in 5 minutes one of the officers of the guard entered in compliance with the strict orders of the cardinal that the prisoner should never be left alone a moment. But during these 5 minutes, the duke had had time to read again the note from Madame de Montbazon, which proved to the prisoner that his friends were concerting plans for his deliverance, but in what way he knew not. But his confidence in Grimaud, whose petty persecutions he now perceived were only a blind, increased, and he conceived the highest opinion of his intellect and resolved to trust entirely to his guidance. Pâtés made by the successor of Father Marteau are described. In half an hour La Ramee returned, full of glee, like most men who have eaten, and more especially drank to their heart's content. The pates were excellent, the wine delicious. The weather was fine, and the game at tennis took place in the open air. At 2 o'clock the tennis balls began, according to Grimaud's directions, to take the direction of the moat, much to the joy of La Ramee, who marked 15 whenever the duke sent a ball into the moat. And very soon balls were wanting, so many had gone over. La Ramee then proposed to send someone to pick them up, but the duke remarked that it would be losing time, and going near the rampart himself and looking over, he saw a man working in one of the numerous little gardens cleared out by the peasants on the opposite side of the moat. "Hey, friend!" cried the duke. The man raised his head, and the duke was about to utter a cry of surprise. The peasant, the gardener, was Rochefort, whom he believed to be in the Bastille. "Well, who's up there?" said the man. "Be so good as to collect and throw us back our balls," said the duke. The gardener nodded and began to fling up the balls, which were picked up by La Ramee and the guard. One, however, fell at the duke's feet, and seeing that it was intended for him, he put it into his pocket. La Ramee was in ecstasies at having beaten a prince of the blood. The duke went indoors and retired to bed, where he spent, indeed, the greater part of every day, as they had taken his books away. La Ramee carried off all his clothes, in order to be certain that the duke would not stir. However, the duke contrived to hide the ball under his bolster, and as soon as the door was closed, he tore off the cover of the ball with his teeth, and found underneath the following letter: "My lord, your friends are watching over you, and the hour of your deliverance is at hand. Ask day after tomorrow to have a pie supplied you by the new confectioner opposite the castle, and who is no other than Noirmont, your former maître d'hôtel. Do not open the pie till you are alone. I hope you will be satisfied with its contents. Your Highness's most devoted servant." In the Bastille, as elsewhere,
Comte de Rochefort.
the duke, who had latterly been allowed a fire, burned the letter, but kept the ball and went to bed, hiding the ball under his bolster. La Ramee entered. He smiled kindly on the prisoner, for he was an excellent man and had taken a great liking for the captive prince. He endeavored to cheer him up in his solitude. "Ah, my friend," cried the duke, "you are so good. If I could but do as you do, and eat pates and drink Burgundy at the house of Father Marteau's successor." "'Tis true, my lord," answered La Ramee, "that his pates are famous and his wine magnificent." "In any case," said the duke, "his cellar and kitchen might easily excel those of Monsieur de Chavigny." "Well, my lord," said La Ramee, falling into the trap, "what is there to prevent your trying them? Besides, I have promised him your patronage." "You are right," said the duke. "If I am to remain here permanently, as Monsieur Mazarin has kindly given me to understand, I must provide myself with a diversion for my old age. I must turn gourmand." "My lord," said La Ramee, If you will take a bit of good advice, don't put that off till you are old." "Good," said the Duc de Beaufort to himself. "Every man, in order that he may lose his heart and soul, must receive from celestial bounty one of the 7 capital sins, perhaps 2. It seems that Master La Ramee's is gluttony. Let us then take advantage of it." Then, aloud, "Well, my dear La Ramee, the day after tomorrow is a holiday." "Yes, my lord, Pentecost. Will you give me a lesson the day after tomorrow?" "In what?" "In gastronomy." "Willingly, my lord. But tete-a-tete, send the guards to take their meal in the canteen of Monsieur de Chavigny. We'll have a supper here under your direction." "Hum," said La Ramee. The proposal was seductive, but La Ramee was an old stager, acquainted with all the traps a prisoner was likely to set. Monsieur de Beaufort had said that he had 40 ways of getting out of prison. Did this proposed breakfast cover some stratagem? He reflected, but he remembered that he himself would have charge of the food and the wine, and therefore that no powder could be mixed with the food, no drug with the wine. As to getting him drunk, the Duke couldn't hope to do that, and he laughed at the mere thought of it. Then an idea came to him which harmonized everything. The Duke had followed with anxiety La Ramee's unspoken soliloquy, reading it from point to point upon his face. But presently the exempt's face suddenly brightened. "Well," he asked, "that will do, will it not?" "Yes, my lord, on one condition." "What?" "That Grimaud shall wait on us at table." Nothing could be more agreeable to the Duke, however. He had presence of mind enough to exclaim, "To the devil with your Grimaud, he will spoil the feast. I will direct him to stand behind your chair, and since he doesn't speak, your Highness will neither see nor hear him, and with a little effort can imagine him 100 miles away. Do you know, my friend, I find one thing very evident in all this: you distrust me. My lord, the day after tomorrow is Pentecost." "Well, what is Pentecost to me? Are you afraid that the Holy Spirit will come as a tongue of fire to open the doors of my prison?" "No, my lord, but I have already told you what that damned magician predicted." "And what was it?" "That the day of Pentecost would not pass without your Highness being out of Vincennes." "You believe in sorcerers, then, you fool?" I mind them no more than that," and he snapped his fingers. "But it is my Lord Giulio who cares about them. As an Italian, he is superstitious." The Duke shrugged his shoulders. "Well then," with well-acted good humor, "I allow Grimaud, but no one else. You must manage it all. Order whatever you like for supper. The only thing I specify is one of those pies, and tell the confectioner that I will promise him my custom if he excels this time in his pies, not only now but when I leave my prison." "Then you think you will some day leave it?" said La Ramee. "The devil," replied the prince. "Surely, at the death of Mazarin, I am 15 years younger than he is. At Vincennes, 'tis true, one lives faster." "My lord," replied La Ramee, "my lord, or dies sooner, for it comes to the same thing." La Ramee was going out. He stopped, however, at the door for an instant. "Whom does your Highness wish me to send to you?" "Anyone except Grimaud." "The officer of the guard, then, with his chessboard?" "Yes." 5 minutes afterward, the officer entered, and the Duke seemed to be immersed in the sublime combinations of chess. A strange thing is the mind, and it is wonderful what revolutions may be wrought in it by a sign, a word, a hope. The Duke had been 5 years in prison, and now to him, looking back upon them, those 5 years, which had passed so slowly, seemed not so long a time as were the 2 days, the 48 hours, which still parted him from the time fixed for his escape. Besides, there was one thing that engaged his most anxious thought. In what way was the escape to be effected? They had told him to hope for it, but had not told him what was to be hidden in the mysterious pat, and what friends awaited him without. He had friends, then, after 5 years in prison? If that were so, he was indeed a highly favored prince. He forgot that besides his friends of his own sex, a woman, strange to say, had remembered him. It is true that she had not, perhaps, been scrupulously faithful to him, but she had remembered him. That was something. So the Duke had more than enough to think about. Accordingly, he fared at chess as he had fared at tennis. He made blunder upon blunder, and the officer with whom he played found him easy game. But his successive defeats did service to the Duke in one way. They killed time for him till 8 o'clock in the evening. Then would come night, and with night, sleep. So at least, the Duke believed. But sleep is a capricious fairy, and it is precisely when one invokes her presence that she is most likely to keep him waiting. The Duke waited until midnight, turning on his mattress like St. Lawrence on his gridiron. Finally, he slept. But at daybreak, he awoke. Wild dreams had disturbed his repose. He dreamed that he was endowed with wings. He wished to fly away. For a time, these wings supported him, but when he reached a certain height, this new aid failed him. His wings were broken, and he seemed to sink into a bottomless abyss, whence he awoke, bathed in perspiration, and nearly as much overcome as if he had really fallen. He fell asleep again, and another vision appeared. He was in a subterranean passage by which he was to leave Vincennes. Grimaud was walking before him with a lantern. By degrees, the passage narrowed, yet the Duke continued his course. At last, it became so narrow that the fugitive tried in vain to proceed. The sides of the walls seemed to close in, even to press against him. He made fruitless efforts to go on. It was impossible. Nevertheless, he still saw Grimaud with his lantern in front, advancing. He wished to call out to him, but could not utter a word. Then, at the other extremity, he heard the footsteps of those who were pursuing him. These steps came fast. He was discovered. All hope of flight was gone. Still, the walls seemed to be closing on him. They appeared to be in concert with his enemies. At last, he heard the voice of La Ramee. La Ramee took his hand and laughed aloud. He was captured again and conducted to the low and vaulted chamber in which Ornano, Poilorens, and his uncle had died. Their 3 graves were there, rising above the ground, and a 4th was also there, yawning for its ghastly tenant. The Duke was obliged to make as many efforts to awake as he had done to go to sleep, and La Ramee found him so pale and fatigued that he inquired whether he was ill. "In fact," said one of the guards who had remained in the chamber and had been kept awake by a toothache, brought on by the dampness of the atmosphere, "my lord has had a very restless night, and 2 or 3 times while dreaming, he called for help." "What is the matter with your highness?" asked La Ramee. "'Tis your fault, you simpleton," answered the Duke. "With your idle nonsense yesterday about escaping, you worried me so that I dreamed that I was trying to escape and broke my neck in doing so." La Ramee laughed. "Come," he said, "'tis a warning from heaven. Never commit such an imprudence as to try to escape, except in your dreams." "And you are right, my dear La Ramee," said the Duke, wiping away the sweat that stood on his brow, wide awake though he was. "After this I will think of nothing but eating and drinking." "Hush," said La Ramee, and one by one he sent away the guards on various pretexts. "Well?" asked the Duke when they were alone. "Well," replied La Ramee, "your supper is ordered." "Ah, and what is it to be? Monsieur, my majordomo, will there be a pie?" "I should think so indeed, almost as high as a tower." "You told him it was for me?" "Yes, and he said he would do his best to please your highness." "Good!" exclaimed the Duke, rubbing his hands. "Devil take it, my lord. What a gourmand you are growing. I haven't seen you with so cheerful a face these 5 years." The Duke saw that he had not controlled himself as he ought, but at that moment, as if he had listened at the door and comprehended the urgent need of diverting La Ramee's ideas, Grimaud entered and made a sign to La Ramee that he had something to say to him. La Ramee drew near to Grimaud, who spoke to him in a low voice. The Duke, meanwhile, recovered his self-control. "I have already forbidden that man," he said, "to come in here without my permission." "You must pardon him, my lord," said La Ramee, "for I directed him to come." "And why did you so direct when you know that he displeases me?" "My lord will remember that it was agreed between us that he should wait upon us at that famous supper. My lord has forgotten the supper." "No, but I have forgotten Monsieur Grimaud. My lord understands that there can be no supper unless he is allowed to be present." "Go on, then. Have it your own way." "Come here, my lad," said La Ramee, "and hear what I have to say." Grimaud approached with a very sullen expression on his face. La Ramee continued, "My lord has done me the honor to invite me to a supper tomorrow en tête-à-tête. Grimaud made a sign which meant that he didn't see what that had to do with him. Yes, yes, said La Ramee. The matter concerns you, for you will have the honor to serve us. And besides, however good an appetite we may have and however great our thirst, there will be something left on the plates and in the bottles, and that something will be yours. Grimaud bowed in thanks. And now, said La Ramee, I must ask your Highness's pardon, but it seems that Monsieur de Chavigny is to be away for a few days, and he has sent me word that he has certain directions to give me before his departure. The Duke tried to exchange a glance with Grimaud, but there was no glance in Grimaud's eyes. Go then, said the Duke, and return as soon as possible. Does your Highness wish to take revenge for the game of tennis yesterday? Grimaud intimated by a scarcely perceptible nod that he should consent. Yes, said the Duke, but take care, my dear La Ramee, for I propose to beat you badly. La Ramee went out. Grimaud looked after him, and when the door was closed, he drew out of his pocket a pencil and a sheet of paper. Write, my lord, he said. And what? Grimaud dictated. All is ready for tomorrow evening. Keep watch from 7 to 9. Have 2 riding horses ready. We shall descend by the first window in the gallery. What next? Sign your name, my lord. The Duke signed. Now, my lord, give me, if you have not lost it, the ball, that which contained the letter. The Duke took it from under his pillow and gave it to Grimaud. Grimaud gave a grim smile. Well, asked the Duke. Well, my lord, I sew up the paper in the ball, and you, in your game of tennis, will send the ball into the ditch. But will it not be lost? Oh no, there will be someone at hand to pick it up. A gardener? Grimaud nodded. The same as yesterday. Another nod on the part of Grimaud. The Count de Rochefort. Grimaud nodded the 3rd time. Come now, said the Duke, give some particulars of the plan for our escape. That is forbidden me, said Grimaud, until the last moment. Who will be waiting for me beyond the ditch? I know nothing about it, my lord. But at least, if you don't want to see me turn crazy, tell what that famous pate will contain. 2 poniards, a knotted rope, and a poire d'angoisse. This poire d'angoisse was a famous gag in the form of a pear, which, being thrust into the mouth by the aid of a spring, dilated so as to distend the jaws to their greatest width. Yes, I understand. My lord observes that there will be enough to go around. We shall take to ourselves the poniards and the rope, replied the Duke. And make La Ramee eat the pear, answered Grimaud. My dear Grimaud, thou speakest seldom, but when thou dost, one must do thee justice. Thy words are words of gold. Chapter 1 of Marie Michon's Adventures. Whilst these projects were being formed by the Duc de Beaufort and Grimaud, the Comte de la Fère and the Vicomte de Bragelonne were entering Paris by the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Marcel. They stopped at the sign of the Fox in the Rue du Vieux Colombier, a tavern known for many years by Athos, and asked for 2 bedrooms. You must dress yourself, Raoul, said Athos. I am going to present you to someone. Today, monsieur? Asked the young man. In half an hour. The young man bowed. Perhaps, not being endowed with the endurance of Athos, who seemed to be made of iron, he would have preferred a bath in the river Seine, of which he had heard so much, and afterward his bed. But the Comte de la Fère had spoken, and he had no thought but to obey. By the way, said Athos, take some pains with your toilet, Raoul. I want you to be approved. I hope, sir, replied the youth, smiling, that there's no idea of a marriage for me. You know of my engagement to Louise? Athos in his turn smiled also. No, don't be alarmed, although it is to a lady that I am going to present you, and I am anxious that you should love her. The young man looked at the Count with a certain uneasiness, but at a smile from Athos he was quickly reassured. How old is she? Inquired the Vicomte de Bragelonne. My dear Raoul, learn once for all that that is a question which is never asked. When you can find out a woman's age by her face, it is useless to ask it. When you cannot do so, it is indiscreet. Is she beautiful? 16 years ago, she was deemed not only the prettiest, but the most graceful woman in France. This reply reassured the Vicomte. A woman who had been a reigning beauty a year before he was born could not be the subject of any scheme for him. He retired to his toilet. When he reappeared, Athos received him with the same paternal smile as that which he had often bestowed on D'Artagnan, but a more profound tenderness for Raoul was now visibly impressed upon his face. Athos cast a glance at his feet, hands, and hair, those three marks of race. The youth's dark hair was neatly parted and hung in curls, forming a sort of dark frame around his face. Such was the fashion of the day. Gloves of gray kid, matching the hat, well displayed the form of a slender and elegant hand, whilst his boots, similar in color to the hat and gloves, confined feet small as those of a boy 12 years old. "Come," murmured Athos, "if she is not proud of him, she must be hard to please." It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The two travelers proceeded to the Rue Saint-Dominique and stopped at the door of a magnificent hotel, surmounted with the arms of de Luynes. "'Tis here," said Athos. He entered the hotel and ascended the front steps, and addressing a footman who waited there in a grand livery, asked if the Duchesse de Chevreuse was visible and if she could receive the Comte de la Fère. The servant returned with a message to say that, though the Duchess had not the honor of knowing Monsieur de la Fère, she would receive him. Athos followed the footman, who led him through a long succession of apartments and paused at length before a closed door. Athos made a sign to the Vicomte de Bragelonne to remain where he was. The footman opened the door and announced Monsieur le Comte de la Fère. Madame de Chevreuse, whose name appears so often in our story, The Three Musketeers, without her actually having appeared in any scene, was still a beautiful woman. Although about 44 or 45 years old, she might have passed for 35. She still had her rich fair hair, her large, animated, intelligent eyes, so often opened by intrigue, so often closed by the blindness of love. She had still her nymph-like form, so that when her back was turned, she still was not unlike the girl who had jumped, with Anne of Austria, over the moat of the Tuileries in 1563. In all other respects, she was the same mad creature who threw over her amours such an air of originality as to make them proverbial for eccentricity in her family. She was in a little boudoir, hung with blue damask, adorned by red flowers, with a foliage of gold, looking upon a garden, and reclined upon a sofa, her head supported on the rich tapestry which covered it. She held a book in her hand, and her arm was supported by a cushion. At the footman's announcement, she raised herself a little and peeped out with some curiosity. Athos appeared. He was dressed in violet-tinted velvet, trimmed with silk of the same color. His shoulder knots were of burnished silver. His mantle had no gold nor embroidery on it. A simple plume of violet feathers adorned his hat. His boots were of black leather, and at his girdle hung that sword with a magnificent hilt that Porthos had so often admired in the Rue Ferrand. Splendid lace adorned the falling collar of his shirt, and lace fell also over the top of his boots. In his whole person, he bore such an impress of high degree that Madame de Chevreuse half rose from her seat when she saw him and made him a sign to sit down near her. Athos bowed and obeyed. The footman was withdrawing, but Athos stopped him by a sign. "Madam," he said to the Duchess, "I have had the boldness to present myself at your hotel without being known to you. It has succeeded, since you deigned to receive me. I have now the boldness to ask you for an interview of half an hour." "I grant it, monsieur," replied Madame de Chevreuse with her most gracious smile. "But that is not all, madam. Oh, I am very presuming, I am aware. The interview for which I ask is of us two alone, and I very earnestly wish that it may not be interrupted." "I am not at home to anyone," said the Duchesse de Chevreuse to the footman. "You may go." The footman went out. There ensued a brief silence, during which these two persons, who at first sight recognized each other so clearly as of noble race, examined each other without embarrassment on either side. The Duchess was the first to speak. "Well, sir, I am waiting with impatience to hear what you wish to say to me." "And I, madame," replied Athos, "am looking with admiration." "Sir," said Madame de Chevreuse, "you must excuse me, but I long to know to whom I am talking. You belong to the court, doubtless, yet I have never seen you at court. Have you, by any chance, been in the Bastille?" No, madam, I have not, but very likely I am on the road to it. Ah, then tell me who you are, and get along with you upon your journey, replied the Duchess, with the gaiety which made her so charming, for I am sufficiently in bad odor already, without compromising myself still more. Who I am, madame? My name has been mentioned to you, the Comte de la Fère. You do not know that name. I once bore another, which you knew, but you have certainly forgotten it. Tell it me, sir. Formerly, said the Count, I was Athos. Madame de Chevreuse looked astonished. The name was not wholly forgotten, but mixed up and confused with ancient recollections. Athos, said she, wait a moment, and she placed her hands on her brow, as if to force the fugitive ideas it contained to concentration in a moment. Shall I help you, madame? Asked Athos. Yes, do, said the Duchess. This Athos was connected with 3 young musketeers, named Porthos, D'Artagnan, and— He stopped short. And Aramis, said the Duchess quickly. And Aramis, I see you have not forgotten the name. No, she said. Poor Aramis, a charming man, elegant, discreet, and a writer of poetical verses. I am afraid he has turned out ill, she added. He is an abbé. Ah, what a misfortune, exclaimed the Duchess, playing carelessly with her fan. Indeed, sir, I thank you. You have recalled one of the most agreeable recollections of my youth. Will you permit me then to recall another to you? Relating to him. Yes and no. Faith, said Madame de Chevreuse, say on. With a man like you, I fear nothing. Athos bowed. Aramis, he continued, was intimate with a young needlewoman from Tours, a cousin of his named Marie Michon. Ah, I knew her, cried the Duchess. It was to her he wrote from the siege of Rochelle to warn her of a plot against the Duke of Buckingham. Exactly so. Will you allow me to speak to you of her? If, replied the Duchess, with a meaning look, you do not say too much against her. I should be ungrateful, said Athos, and I regard ingratitude not as a fault or a crime, but as a vice, which is much worse. You ungrateful to Marie Michon, monsieur, said Madame de Chevreuse, trying to read in Athos's eyes. But how can that be? You never knew her. Eh, madame, who knows? Said Athos. There is a popular proverb to the effect that it is only mountains that never meet, and popular proverbs contain sometimes a wonderful amount of truth. Oh, go on, monsieur, go on, said Madame de Chevreuse eagerly. You can't imagine how much this conversation interests me. You encourage me, said Athos. I will continue then. That cousin of Aramis, that Marie Michon, that needlewoman, notwithstanding her low condition, had acquaintances in the highest rank. She called the grandest ladies of the court her friend, and the queen, proud as she is in her double character as Austrian and as Spaniard, called her her sister. Alas, said Madame de Chevreuse with a slight sigh and a little movement of her eyebrows that was peculiarly her own, since that time everything has changed. And the queen had reason for her affection, for Marie was devoted to her, devoted to that degree that she served her as medium of intercourse with her brother, the King of Spain. Which, interrupted the Duchess, is now brought up against her as a great crime. And therefore, continued Athos, the cardinal, the true cardinal, the other one, determined one fine morning to arrest poor Marie Michon and send her to the Château de Loches. Fortunately, the affair was not managed so secretly, but that it became known to the queen. The case had been provided for. If Marie Michon should be threatened with any danger, the queen was to send her a prayer book bound in green velvet. That is true, monsieur. You are well informed. One morning, the green book was brought to her by the Prince de Marsillac. There was no time to lose. Happily, Marie and a follower of hers named Kitty could disguise themselves admirably in men's clothes. The prince procured for Marie Michon the dress of a cavalier and for Kitty that of a lackey. He sent them 2 excellent horses, and the fugitives went out hastily from Tours, shaping their course toward Spain, trembling at the least noise, following unfrequented roads, and asking for hospitality when they found themselves where there was no inn. Why, really, it was all exactly as you say, cried Madame de Chevreuse, clapping her hands. It would indeed be strange if— she checked herself. If I should follow the 2 fugitives to the end of their journey, said Athos. No, madame, I will not thus waste your time. We will accompany them only to a little village in Limousin, lying between Toul and Angoulême, a little village called Roche-l'Abeille. Madame de Chevreuse uttered a cry of surprise and looked at Athos with an expression of astonishment that made the old musketeer smile. "Wait, madame," continued Athos. "What remains for me to tell you is even more strange than what I have narrated." "Monsieur," said Madame de Chevreuse, "I believe you are a sorcerer. I am prepared for anything. But really, no matter, go on." The journey of that day had been long and wearing. It was a cold day, the 11th of October. There was no inn or chateau in the village, and the homes of the peasants were poor and unattractive. Marie Michon was a very aristocratic person. Like her sister the queen, she had been accustomed to pleasing perfumes and fine linen. She resolved, therefore, to seek hospitality of the priest. Athos paused. "Oh, continue," said the Duchess. "I have told you that I am prepared for anything." The two travelers knocked at the door. It was late. The priest, who had gone to bed, cried out to them to come in. They entered, for the door was not locked. There is much confidence among villagers. A lamp burned in the chamber occupied by the priest. Marie Michon, who made the most charming cavalier in the world, pushed open the door, put her head in, and asked for hospitality. "Willingly, my young cavalier," said the priest, "if you will be content with the remains of my supper and with half my chamber." The two travelers consulted for a moment. The priest heard a burst of laughter, and then the master, or rather the mistress, replied, "Thank you, monsieur le curé, I accept." "Sup, then, and make as little noise as possible," said the priest, "for I too have been on the go all day, and shall not be sorry to sleep tonight." Madame de Chevreuse evidently went from surprise to astonishment, and from astonishment to stupefaction. Her face, as she looked at Athos, had taken on an expression that cannot be described. It could be seen that she had wished to speak, but she had remained silent through fear of losing one of her companion's words. "What happened then?" she asked. "Then?" said Athos. "Ah, I have come now to what is most difficult." "Speak, speak. One can say anything to me. Besides, it doesn't concern me. It relates to Mademoiselle Marie Michon." "Ah, that is true," said Athos. "Well, then, Marie Michon had supper with her follower, and then, in accordance with the permission given her, she entered the chamber of her host, Kitty meanwhile taking possession of an armchair in the room first entered, where they had taken their supper. "Really, monsieur," said Madame de Chevreuse, "unless you are the devil in person, I don't know how you could become acquainted with all these details." "A charming woman was that Marie Michon," resumed Athos, "one of those wild creatures who are constantly conceiving the strangest ideas. Now, thinking that her host was a priest, that coquette took it into her head that it would be a happy souvenir for her old age, among the many happy souvenirs she already possessed, if she could win that of having damned an abbé." "Count," said the Duchess, "upon my word, you frighten me." "Alas," continued Athos, "the poor abbé was not a Saint Ambroise, and I repeat, Marie Michon was an adorable creature." "Monsieur," cried the Duchess, seizing Athos's hands, "tell me this moment how you know all these details, or I will send to the convent of the Vieux Augustins for a monk to come and exorcise you." Athos laughed. "Nothing is easier, madame. A cavalier, charged with an important mission, had come an hour before your arrival, seeking hospitality, at the very moment that the curé, summoned to the bedside of a dying person, left not only his house but the village, for the entire night. The priest, having all confidence in his guest, who, besides, was a nobleman, had left to him his house, his supper, and his chamber. And therefore Marie came seeking hospitality from the guest of the good abbé, and not from the good abbé himself. And that cavalier, that guest, that nobleman who arrived before she came—" "It was I, the Comte de la Fère," said Athos, rising and bowing respectfully to the Duchesse de Chevreuse. The Duchess remained a moment stupefied, then, suddenly bursting into laughter, "Ah, upon my word," said she, "it is very droll, and that mad Marie Michon fared better than she expected. Sit down, dear Count, and go on with your story." "At this point I have to accuse myself of a fault, madame. I have told you that I was traveling on an important mission. At daybreak, I left the chamber without noise, leaving my charming companion asleep. In the front room, the follower was also still asleep, her head leaning back on the chair, in all respects worthy of her mistress. Her pretty face arrested my attention. I approached and recognized that little kitty whom our friend Aramis had placed with her. In that way I discovered that the charming traveler was Marie Michon, said Madame de Chevreuse hastily. Marie Michon, continued Athos. Then I went out of the house. I proceeded to the stable and found my horse saddled and my lackey ready. We set forth on our journey. And have you never revisited that village? Eagerly asked Madame de Chevreuse. A year after, madame. Well, I wanted to see the good curé again. I found him much preoccupied with an event that he could not at all comprehend. A week before he had received, in a cradle, a beautiful little boy 3 months old, with a purse filled with gold and a note containing these simple words, 11 October, 1633. It was the date of that strange adventure, interrupted Madame de Chevreuse. Yes, but he couldn't understand what it meant, for he had spent that night with a dying person, and Marie Michon had left his house before his return.
You must know, monsieur, that Marie Michon, when she returned to France in 1643, immediately sought for information about that child. As a fugitive, she could not take care of it, but on her return, she wished to have it near her.
And what said the abbé? Asked Athos. That a nobleman, whom he did not know, had wished to take charge of it, had answered for its future, and had taken it away. That was true. Ah, I see. That nobleman was you. It was his father. Hush, do not speak so loud, madame. He is there. He is there, my son, the son of Marie Michon, but I must see him instantly. Take care, madame, said Athos, for he knows neither his father nor his mother. You have kept the secret. You have brought him to see me, thinking to make me happy. Oh, thanks, sir, thanks, cried Madame de Chevreuse, seizing his hand and trying to put it to her lips. You have a noble heart. I bring him to you, madame, said Athos, withdrawing his hand, hoping that in your turn you will do something for him. Till now I have watched over his education, and I have made him, I hope, an accomplished gentleman. But I am now obliged to return to the dangerous and wandering life of party faction. Tomorrow I plunge into an adventurous affair in which I may be killed. Then it will devolve on you to push him on in that world where he is called on to occupy a place. Rest assured, cried the Duchess, I shall do what I can. I have but little influence now, but all that I have shall most assuredly be his. As to his title and fortune, as to that, madame, I have made over to him the estate of Bragelonne, my inheritance, which will give him 10,000 francs a year and the title of Vicomte. Upon my soul, monsieur, said the Duchess, you are a true nobleman, but I am eager to see our young Vicomte. Where is he? There, in the salon. I will have him come in, if you really wish it. Athos moved toward the door. The Duchess held him back. Is he handsome? She asked. Athos smiled. He resembles his mother. So he opened the door and beckoned the young man in. The Duchess could not restrain a cry of joy on seeing so handsome a young cavalier, so far surpassing all that her maternal pride had been able to conceive. Vicomte, come here, said Athos. The Duchess permits you to kiss her hand. The youth approached with his charming smile and his head bare, and kneeling down, kissed the hand of the Duchesse de Chevreuse. Sir, he said, turning to Athos, was it not in compassion to my timidity that you told me that this lady was the Duchesse de Chevreuse, and is she not the queen? No, Vicomte, said Madame de Chevreuse, taking his hand and making him sit near her, while she looked at him with eyes sparkling with pleasure. No, unhappily, I am not the queen. If I were, I should do for you at once the most that you deserve. But let us see, whatever I may be, she added, hardly restraining herself from kissing that pure brow. Let us see what profession you wish to follow. Athos, standing, looked at them both with indescribable pleasure. Madame, answered the youth in his sweet voice, it seems to me that there is only one career for a gentleman, that of the army. I have been brought up by Monsieur le Comte with the intention, I believe, of making me a soldier, and he gave me reason to hope that at Paris he would present me to someone who would recommend me to the favor of the prince. Yes, I understand it well. Personally, I am on bad terms with him, on account of the quarrels between Madame de Montbazon, my mother-in-law, and Madame de Longueville. But the Prince de Marsillac— Yes, indeed, that's the right thing. The Prince de Marsillac, my old friend, will recommend our young friend to Madame de Longueville, who will give him a letter to her brother, the prince, who loves her too tenderly not to do what she wishes immediately. Well, that will do charmingly, said the Count, but may I beg that the greatest haste may be made, for I have reasons for wishing the Vicomte not to sleep longer than tomorrow night in Paris. Do you wish it known that you are interested about him, Monsieur le Comte? Better for him in future that he should be supposed never to have seen me. Oh, sir, cried Raoul. You know, Bragelonne, said Athos, I never speak without reflection. Well, Comte, I am going instantly, interrupted the Duchess, to send for the Prince de Marsillac, who is happily in Paris just now. What are you going to do this evening? We intend to visit the Abbé Scarron, for whom I have a letter of introduction, and at whose house I expect to meet some of my friends. 'Tis well, I will go there also for a few minutes, said the Duchess. Do not quit his salon until you have seen me. Athos bowed and prepared to leave. Well, Monsieur le Comte, said the Duchess, smiling, does one leave so solemnly his old friends? Ah, murmured Athos, kissing her hand, had I only sooner known that Marie Michon was so charming a creature. And he withdrew, sighing.